Winnipeg fans, Frank Saravalli seems to think the Jets might be one of the more active teams this offseason. Not the Calgary Flames, not the Toronto Maple Leafs, the Winnipeg Jets. We're going to talk about what would be a successful offseason for the Jets and how they could potentially come out stronger if they play their cards right on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. As always, thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is free of charge, but most importantly, we just really love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Stay tuned to hear more about how Gametime can help make buying event tickets easy, fast, and affordable. Now, like I said, tonight's episode, I want to spend some time talking about the Jets as they prepare for what could be a very busy offseason. We've talked about, some of the stuff before, more specifically what I hope they do. Now, I thought what would be worth taking some time aside to discuss is how the Jets can make themselves stronger after this offseason, because obviously, when you have an exodus of talent, I think the biggest question is, what are you left with and how can you turn this ship around within a reasonable amount of time? Because for me, I think the Jets might not have to go full rebuild. I know that we've used the rebuild word before, but with where Winnipeg is at, what they have in the pipeline, and where some of their players are at in terms of their ages, with the right trades and the right acquisitions, Winnipeg could be back being competitive in the next 2 to 3 seasons, right? There will be a year or two where things are kind of grim, let's be real. But after that, the Jets might actually be reasonably decent, again, if they play their cards right. Now, I think the one thing that we all know is that in net, they're not going to be as strong. I know that Dom DiVincentis is looking like a really good prospect. Eskari Salmonen has been okay at times for the Moose. But generally speaking, I think if Hellebuyck goes this offseason, there's not really going to be a replacement option. I mean, it's just, you can't really replace a Vezina caliber goalie, especially with what the Jets have now. I think most likely Winnipeg's best option is you trade Hellebuyck, you get a goalie who essentially fills in as like a placeholder, not somebody that you're intending to keep around long term. One thing I've thought about from folks kind of talking about it on Twitter is if the Jets took on like a cap dump, right? A Jack Campbell, a Cam Talbot, one of these guys who maybe has struggled recently, hasn't been as productive. You can either bet on a rebound or just accept that they're most likely not going to be good, but you look for a player that maybe has lower salary towards the end of a contract, right? These guys, again, like I said, they're going to be more, roster placeholders. If they're bad in that, no big deal, because the reality is for at least a year or so, you're okay with tanking. You're not really looking to be like bottom of the barrel, but, a higher top 10 draft pick, maybe even a shot at a lotto pick, really wouldn't be the worst thing for at least a season, because you are going to have a pretty large exodus of talent. So I think the main thing with the Hellebuyck trade is that you want to have a really good selection of futures. I think the Jets could potentially get a pretty decent haul for Helly, just because I think over the last year or two, teams have increasingly looked at the goalie market and sort of recognized that elite goalies really don't become available. I know like the prevailing wisdom for a long time has been goalies are the cheapest because reasons, right? The market never really seems to support a netminder being particularly expensive on the trade market. But I think this might be one of the first years where that might buck the trend. I think if you look league-wide and you see where a lot of these competitive teams are, what is the one thing that many of them are missing? And if you look closely enough, you realize it's a goalie. You can have guys who are league average or above league average, but in those really decisive moments where you need somebody to be super clutch and to really be that next level keeper, we haven't really seen many goalies step up to the plate. And so I think Helly is a unique example in that, by and large, people know that he is a beast. Now, his playoff performance, past couple of years, it's been a little bit up and down, but for me, that's just like a sample size volatility thing. Obviously, Hellebuyck wasn't great against Vegas, but you're not really buying him just for playoff experience. You want him because he is one of the best goalies on the market, and if you pair him with the right team, there's a good chance that you're going to see pretty good results from a guy who has been a Vezina winner and is a three-time Vezina finalist. So for me, I think the Jets could do really well if they exchange Hellebuyck for futures and then bring on at least some kind of a goalie who can just eat minutes. I don't even care at this point if it's a crap goalie. I just think it's important to try and get as much of a haul as you can. If that involves taking back salary so that you can increase the futures package, do it. I think the Jets could set themselves up very well for the next couple of seasons, again, if they do and play their cards right. And you might also be able to get a goaltending prospect out of this. I don't know that you'll be able to get like an elite one, but you probably could get a guy who's doing well in the minors. Probably not a player like Dustin Wolf, unfortunately. I think that would be a little bit too much to expect, but a reasonably good caliber, quality goalie prospect. Something that you could potentially get within the next 2 to 3 years into the NHL. Maybe could be an option. Something to keep an eye out, but certainly, for the Jets, Hellebuyck has been a beast, has been our workhorse, but he's not going to be around for much longer. So prepare yourselves for that, because I think the reality is that trade is coming sooner than any of us probably feel comfortable with. Now, the Jets could also do well for themselves in a couple of other deals. We'll talk about what that might look like in just a little bit. Before we go any further, though, I do want to shout out our friends and partners at Gametime. Buying tickets to your favorite event should not be as stressful and as expensive as it is, but a lot of you know that concert tickets and sport tickets, they aren't cheap, and it's not always easy to buy them. That's why Gametime is here to help with a very convenient app that lets you find the best last-minute and flash deals, and you even get in-arena and event venue seat views, right? You get a photo from where you're sitting, which is great because a lot of you don't want to find yourselves with obstructed views. You just paid $300 for a Red Sox ticket, and you get a nice view of a pillar from the support structure. Who wants to pay and buy that, right? With Gametime, you can be sure that you're going to avoid that, and best of all, those last-minute ticket prices tend to be pretty darn low. And if you find a ticket in the same row and section that is cheaper than what you're paying, Gametime will credit you 110% of the difference. And of course, they come with great guarantees, like cancellation guarantees and protection, all of that fun stuff. And of course, they always want to make sure that you get the lowest price every time. So download the Gametime app, create an account, and use promo code LOCKEDON NHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, that is promo code LOCKEDON NHL for $20 off when you create an account on the Gametime app. Download Gametime today. Lowest last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Hello, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks for joining us again on tonight's episode. Obviously, for Winnipeg, we're talking about how Winnipeg can kind of win their offseason. I think that's a very relative term. I think we all know that the Jets are maybe not in the best position right now. Things are looking grim over the next couple of years, a lot of major UFAs, but Winnipeg could still potentially come out here looking halfway decent. For Winnipeg, I think the biggest thing is making sure that you get fair value for a lot of the players that you're about to trade. Connor Hellebuyck is one of the bigger trade pieces. There are some other guys who would be really valuable. I think for me, Kyle Connor is one of the other big ones. But I can't imagine that Kyle Connor is going to be moved just because I think Winnipeg looks at his contract control, looks at the remaining years on his deal, and the fact that the team still wants to be semi-competitive and thinks, yeah, he's the last guy we really want to trade. Now, in terms of other moves that I think are really crucial for the Jets to try and stabilize this team long-term, For me, one of the big ones is getting Dylan Samberg locked up. I know that's kind of like a weird thing to talk about when we were just talking about trade stuff, but for Samberg, for me, this guy has been an absolute beast. Samberg very clearly is ready for second pairing duty. He's kind of killed his minutes this season, and sure, he'll have moments where he maybe fumbles a puck, maybe doesn't get the read quite right. But for a young defender who has done as well as he has, he's been like one of the top defensive players on this whole team. It just makes sense to lock him up for multiple seasons. He's been really good in the minutes that he's been given. It's clear that he's ready for his role to grow. And if you give him the right partner, he actually might be an amazing second pairing defender. As it is, he's already really good. So at this point, it's just finding the next level for him and giving the Jets a much more stable top four. We've seen a lot of fluidity and movement with this blue line unit. It'd be nice if Samberg can kind of anchor a second pairing that is close to the quality of the first. Obviously, your first pairing is going to be one where Morrissey does a lot of the heavy lifting. The second pairing probably would need a more active partner for Dylan to really shine, but that's something that you can figure out down the road. Main thing this offseason, get Samberg committed at a reasonable cap hit. Dylan is very clearly a part of this team's longer-term future. I think he's proven that beyond a shadow of a doubt. The team seems to love him. I hope that he loves Winnipeg, and it'd be nice to see him back for 4 or 5 years for the next several seasons. Now, on a related note, I think the blue line in general really needs a bit of a restructuring. We have a couple of guys who are expiring soon, and a couple of players that probably just need to be moved. Right? I think that's always a tough conversation, but one of the big things that the Jets could do this offseason that would really help them out a lot is finding a place for Neal. We all love Pionk. We love his bubble performance. We know that he could be a really fun player at times, but unfortunately, I think the past couple of seasons have really shown that the version of Neal that we thought would come back out of the bubble season hasn't really materialized. If anything, Neal has kind of gone back to his Rangers days, and for like almost $6 million cap hit, it's just not working out. I wish it had gone differently, because in terms of the things that Neal says and how he views his own performance, I always feel like he's honest about his quality of play. I think he's been very accountable, and there's no question in my mind that when it comes to players who leave it all on the ice, Neal has always been one of those guys who is that kind of player, always blocking shots, fighting for the puck, and really just laying it all out there. But in terms of the results, they just haven't been there. And I think for what the Jets need long term, unfortunately, Pionk just doesn't really tick off enough boxes. And I guess my big question is, how does the rest of the league see him? Is he a player that other teams would covet? I'm not really sure, because, if we're seeing this stuff, if we know that he's struggling defensively, other teams would probably have to know that as well. But I guess the overriding thing is, do they see his point scoring and think that is good? Because Pionk offensively is still very effective. There's a quality attacking blue liner there. And if you find, I guess, the right environment for him, maybe you could try and mitigate some of his defensive woes. He's been really bad this season, to the point where I don't know that you can really shelter him any more than the Jets have tried in the past. But I really feel like even if you protected him with the right partner and gave him limited controlled minutes, I think you'd still see a lot of the defensive issues arise. It's just he'd be outscoring some of his issues enough to be of value. Now, whether it's $5.875 million of value, I think that's a debatable question. But for the Jets, getting that contract off the book and getting that cap space, or at least even part of that cap space, would go a very big way towards making this offseason a lot more successful. The more flexibility and room you give yourself, the better off this team will be in the short and long term. And I know that Pionk only has like a year or so after the season, but the reality is, the earlier you deal with this stuff and the more that you give yourself some buffer room and cushion to deal with maybe a major contract extension or something, the better off you'll be, and you'll be, of course, being or reaping the dividends of what could be that extra little bit of space for that major signing. So something to keep an eye out on. Maybe the Jets could even get a decent prospect or something out of a Pionk trade. Who knows? But honestly, just moving that contract in general would give the Jets some major options. Now, there are one or two other things I think the Jets could do to have a particularly successful offseason. We'll talk about what those things are in just a moment. Hello, friends, and welcome back to these closing thoughts on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks for joining us again for these final thoughts on tonight's episode of Locked On Jets. We're just talking about Winnipeg trying to deal with a very active offseason and how they can win it. Obviously, there's not many scenarios where the Jets are going to come out of this offseason stronger, at least on paper. But in terms of setting themselves up for the future, you never know, right? Winnipeg might actually give themselves a couple of decent options, especially at forward. I think one of the big things for the Jets is really going to be swinging for upside when they trade some of their expiring assets. Now, the Mark Scheifele trade and, say, maybe even a Nito Niederreiter trade, you're going to get differing levels of quality in return. Scheifele should get a big return. Niederreiter, probably not if you were to trade him. So for me, Nino's not really a priority to move until you're closer to the trade deadline next season. But Scheifele this offseason, yes. I think it's probably time. I think that this relationship has kind of reached the point at which it's time to say goodbye. And Scheifele, for me, has been one of the most effective players on this team and also one of the most frustrating. But a lot of teams are going to see his season this year and see a guy who, on the right team, is going to get close to 50 goals. I mean, he had 42 this season, and that includes a couple of really dry spells where he wasn't really as active and as engaged as he was at the start of the year. If you do trade Scheifele, you're going to get a pretty decent haul. And I think this is where the Jets could maybe get a younger roster player, somebody who maybe hasn't quite hit that level yet, but you could envision them really taking flight soon. For me, you look at the Rangers, and a guy like Filip Chytil is kind of like one of those ideal candidates. Chytil did just sign an extension, and I would imagine that Chytil is probably not a player the Rangers are super keen to move, but if you're putting all of your eggs in one basket, trying to go for it one last time with this whole group, and trying to really push the limits of how much you can get away with, Scheifele is the kind of player that you could really get a lot of mileage out of. He'd be a massive upgrade to their top six. He'd very clearly have more offensive impact than Chytil, which I know people will say, what? How's that possible if, for some Rangers fans? But we all know Scheifele at his best, he is almost unstoppable. And I think for where that team is, developmentally speaking and sort of rebuild-wise, right, since they tried to expedite their timeline, it didn't exactly work, but Scheifele could put them with a lot more, or could put them in a much better position, competitively speaking, right now, especially in such a tough division. Other places Scheifele could go, you could say Carolina would make a lot of sense. The Canes have a lot of cap space that they could probably clear out if they are smart, and they have the prospects and stuff to also get a deal done. They have a lot of great futures, and I think it would make a lot of sense for them because, finishing is one of their big weaknesses and issues. Scheifele would definitely be a player who fills a lot of those needs. One outside name I kind of wonder about is LA. The Kings are kind of in an odd spot of being a strong team that lacks a little bit of the high-end upside. For one thing, the goalie situation there is not great, so Hellebuyck would probably be their first preference if they're making a trade with the Jets, but assuming that they maybe don't swing a Hellebuyck trade, where else could they extract value? And it's going to be at forward. Scheifele would very clearly be a huge upgrade for them as well. Having a 1-2 of Mark and Anze down the middle would be fantastic for that team. I think it'd make them far more lethal. They'd be one of the few teams that I think could really swing a major Scheifele or Hellebuyck deal. You could put the Jets in a pretty good position long-term with some great prospects, maybe some decent picks. I just think that there's a natural symmetry there and an alignment of what the Jets and the Kings need that could see a deal blossom. Now, Scheifele really hasn't been linked to the Kings before, and I think, again, like I said, between him and Hellebuyck, they'd very clearly go for Hellebuyck first. But in the off chance that maybe they're looking for more forward help, that could be an option. Maybe they send Arvidsson back the other way, and you also get a package of prospects and picks or whatever. I don't really know what LA's vision or view of Scheifele is, but hey, there's a lot of teams that could very much use Mark's talents, and I think he'd blossom at almost any team that favors a more high offense or high tempo attack. So something to keep an eye out on. Let me know what you think the Jets could get for Scheifele in the comments below, or at my social medias at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's episode, though, that is going to be all the time that we have. Thanks so much for making us your first listen of the day, every day. Every day, as we will see you back here tomorrow with some more playoff coverage. And as always, thanks so much for listening. Have a great night, and go Jets go.